as a pastor or ministry leader, if you keep on doing that for very long, you're going to implode and you're going to be one of the stories that we get to see about. It doesn't do any good for us to have Sunday mornings where we wow people to our excellence rather than going ahead and giving them tools in which to see the excellence of Jesus in their everyday lives.
Jonathan, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
You're welcome. You're church planner, author. You probably would never introduce yourselves as those things. How would you introduce yourself if you were to meet me at a coffee house for the first time?
Gardening, fanatic, sourdough maker, and book lover. I love reading books. I don't know how I'd introduce you. It'd probably be based off of what I picked up about you, because I'm a bit of a jack of all trades, but I love to pastor. I love that I get to do that, and I've been doing that for the last couple of years, and I do enjoy that.
Okay. How old is the church plant?
We just celebrated 8 years in February.
When was the hardest year?
I think the hardest year probably was 2022. 2020 was obviously hard, and the years before that were hard, but 2022 is probably the hardest.
All right. Is it everything you thought it was going to be?
Oh, yes and no. I've told people before that, there was expectations I had going into it, what the church would look like, what it would be like to lead it, the size, the experience, the whole thing. And in many ways, it hasn't been that. And that's been okay in some ways. And in other ways, there's been things that God's given along the way that I wouldn't even have thought to dream of or expect. And they've been just sweet moments that God's given. So it's not been what I expected. In some ways, that's disappointing. In other ways, it's been so much better than I would have expected.
Yeah. Would you do it all over again if you had the choice?
Only if he told me to.
Okay. Only if he told you.
Only if he made me do it.
I asked that question. It's like, why would you ask that? Like, what was it like in 2019? Like 40% of all pastors said they'd quit ministry if they could.
And then in 2019?
Yeah.
And
that was before COVID.
I was going to say, then what happened in 2020?
And before all of the
70%.
I know. I wish there was a stat that had been,
right?
I think it's, yeah. That was before. I do think like the COVID, BLM, the
election that year was just nuts.
Everything. Yeah. Lord have mercy.
Yeah. I've heard it said before, people say when it comes to pastoral ministry, I think it was probably some college professor that got quoted over and over again, telling their students, listen, if you can see yourself, if you kind of want to do anything other than this, go do that. It's kind of that if you're not all in on this and if you're not confident that God has called you to it, don't do it. And I think that's maybe a bit extreme, but honestly, it's a lot. There's a lot of demands on ministry, and it is difficult.
And I think there's a differentiation between them, like those that get into it because it was a career, and then those that get into it because they felt, like you said, like if God called.
Yeah.
And it's in there, and like if it is just a career, you probably there's a big difference. So let's talk about your why. Like why do the church plant? Why do what you do?
Yeah. I will say, though, I think that, interestingly enough, I think you could succeed if you went into ministry as a career or if you went into it as a passion, and you could fail based off either of those. Because if you can run a church well, you can succeed by a lot of standards and feel great about it and maybe be doing a lot of great things. And there may not be that overwhelming passion, but you're still serving the Lord and it'd be great. You can have that passion that we would think, oh, that's the person who really is going to succeed. And then you realize that ministry takes a lot more than just passion, and it can crush you. And then you can become disheartened. And I think it's those people that unfortunately I've seen not only get burnt by ministry, but leave church altogether and want nothing to do with it because they had a passion. They didn't have maybe a skill set for certain things, and they felt like they got robbed in the process. But I'm sorry, what was your question that you had just asked?
No,
why?
It's thought provoking though, of our own why.
Yeah.
And then what's going to sustain us when we are in ministry, but what's your why for what you do?
My personal why, not joking, is because God called me to do this.
Yeah.
It was very clear when I was in youth ministry. It was very clear at 12 years old when God called me into ministry, and then confirmed by my parents and a youth pastor. And then went into youth ministry and loved it. Like, it was just a really satisfying calling on my life, and I felt like God had designed me for it. So it was one of those things where I felt like I was the tool, to use that kind of crass terminology, being used by God, and I was like, this is what I was used for. This is what I was designed for in some ways. And then He called me out of youth ministry to plant this church in a city that I didn't know and never even heard of, didn't know anybody from. So if it wasn't for the Lord calling me, there really wouldn't have been any logic to me coming to Fredericksburg and moving here and planting it. So my why was first that God told me to do it. He really burdened my heart for these people, for this city, and for doing the work of planting a new church, making disciples here in this growing area. My why continues to be a lot of two things: the glory of God, that He's so good, continually reminding myself and spending time with Him and just seeing He's so good and worth being admired and worshiped by all people. And then getting to know people and seeing where the goodness of God and the greatness of God meet them in their everyday lives. So it's fun for me to make it very practical, because it's not just this theological study or this philosophical understanding of God. It's, we serve a real God who cares about real people, and in this area, there's no shortage of problems that people are facing. And so, while there are areas in the world that I have a big heart for, that they need the gospel, there's not a presence readily available to them of a gospel witness. I do still believe that in this area, there's definitely a need for life-giving churches that are actively making disciples for Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. So for those not, listening who don't know, like, you and I both partner with Fredericksburg Missions Collective.
Mm-hmm.
We have this emphasis on mobilizing missionaries to, and also advocating for missions to the unreached. And I recently was talking to a friend of mine who was talking like how his pastors, where they live, talk about there's unreached right down the road.
Yeah, that's a different definition probably of unreached. And that's where it gets confusing with the Fredericksburg Missions Collective, is where training and informing people is that idea that, like, some people think my neighbor's unreached because I see that they don't go to church on Sundays. And when I asked them about God once, if they did, they said, we don't really believe in that religious stuff. But that neighbor has likely, not guaranteed, but likely heard about Jesus, gotten to at least once or twice, or maybe 100 times when they were a kid in church, hear the gospel message. They've maybe refused it. That's a different kind of unreached than you'll get in parts of India or parts of Afghanistan or Turkey or places like that, where they don't know Jesus, maybe at all. Yeah, and if they do, they've never heard the gospel.
You probably work with a Christian, know a Christian,
right?
Drive by who knows how many churches, pass by the K101 radio station, love whatever it is, Chris Tomlin, I don't know.
So you're not
like, there's access everywhere. So
you're not what's the word I'm looking for? You're not unaware. You're just not sold.
May not have been invited directly yet.
Yeah, maybe not even that, but you're probably aware, you're just not convinced. Whereas
access.
People in so many parts of the world, they're not convinced because they've never been made aware. Other than God revealing Himself in creation, the specific revelation of Jesus Himself hasn't been made because nobody's told them yet. So it's a different kind of unreached. When they say, oh yeah, I've got an unreached neighbor down the street, it's very likely, like you just said, that's a very different world than what we mean when we say unreached.
And the point would be, like, they're down the street from you.
Yeah.
And you could reach them.
Yep.
Whereas, like, when we talk about unreached, we're talking about people who, like, they will not hear about Jesus unless someone talks about Jesus to them, because there's no access anywhere. Mm-hmm. But that's not the point of this discussion. The whole point was, we talk about making disciples, and there's this, like, we care about this over there, but your heart was for this Fredericksburg area. And let's bring it back to then, like, local discipleship, disciple making, because what we're trying to do is create really like ideation, give people inspiration, talk about the high challenge, high grace of what does it look like to get churches out of just focusing on the Sunday service and being attendance based, and just creating good fans, good churchgoers, but, like, what does it look like to do better discipleship, more intentional, more strategic discipleship that comes full circle to sending out disciple makers. Mm-hmm. And that's where I'd like to take the conversation with you, and then we could probably still have fun taking it to the unreached, because that would be a fun one. But I think I'm actually glad we got to bring it up. So 'cause I think so few. There's a lot of pastors, and maybe listening to this. Like I've talked with pastors where they were like, "What do you mean unreached?" And so yeah, look up the 1040 window, please. And I would love to chat with anyone, as would you. But let's talk about discipleship. How would you define it?
That's a great question. I think we can keep it simple. Yeah. Teaching them to obey all that Jesus commanded.
Okay.
As Jesus kind of said in the Great Commission that we were called to make disciples that did that. It wasn't just teaching them what he commanded, teaching them to obey, but that would be one simple definition. So teaching and training people what it looks like to follow Jesus.
So to be very pointed, like, does Sunday morning church service, like, does it crush it? Meaning, like, does it win at discipleship?
I know I have an axe in this, a dog in this fight, an axe to grind, perhaps, as a pastor of a church who does Sunday mornings. And we do the Sunday morning thing.
Yeah.
I would say this, Alex. I think it's an important part. It's an integral part, but can be overinflated, and it's definitely not everything. In fact, if it's made to be the main thing out of all the other things and everything else gets, put on the back burner or doesn't get done, then we've pretty much robbed that moment, even if any of it's thunder at all.
So you'd say, like, the Sunday morning service is not, like, that's not at the very, you could either say primary or best or the only place to do the training and the equipping.
Yeah.
So then what does that look like? And I bring that, and it's a question, but I think it could feel threatening to people who feel like Sunday morning is what they put their whole life into. And I do, by the way, like, I think there's value in Sunday morning service. Not that it has to be on Sunday morning, but in a church service.
Yeah.
But I do see that if that's the only emphasis, then there is this, it's like you're missing these other muscles, and I don't know how to describe that, but, like, maybe you can.
Well, I was thinking about this, getting ready for our conversation today, and you've got 2 kids now, right?
Yeah.
And, if those 2 kids, if you have any more down the road, you have these moments as they get older where you're going to have family dinner and you're going to have these meaningful conversations. Or you might have a family meeting where you have to just, no food's involved, just everyone get together and we're going to talk about something that's going on in life. Hey, we have an update about a family member, or hey, we're going to make plans for a vacation, whatever it might be. Those big gatherings are important. Big gatherings in your whole family together, they matter. The communication in that moment matters, but it's not to say that it doesn't matter to go one-on-one with your kids, to have a conversation with your wife beforehand, to have those to use that metaphor. I think that there's a little bit of the strategic element to a one gathering. Everyone's gathered together. One, again, it's biblical to worship and sing songs of worship, to share testimonies, to pray together, and to hear the preaching of God's word, the opening of God's word, the revelation of Jesus in the word, and encouragement through that. But if it's just that broad kind of communication, it's never down a layer, what ends up happening is you get a lot of misunderstanding, because your kids might walk out of that meeting and go, oh, this is what we're doing. And if you talk one-on-one with them, you get, oh, no, that's not what we're doing. Here's what we're doing, or here's what we decided, or whatever. And I think that just even on the level of communication, it's really good to have a level down one-on-one kind of environment where people can process those kinds of things. I've had plenty of messages where I thought I preached so clearly, and it was just, you couldn't, and then people afterwards, and I realized in conversation, you misunderstood. I guess we just didn't connect as well. But I think that, I'll just go for a little bit here. I think that when I was thinking about what is discipleship and all, I think that a lot of people are going to feel like either they're failing or the church is failing because it's so unclear in the way that we like clarity what the win is or what it looks like to do. It would just be so much easier, which is why, and I'm not here to, pick on churches that do this, but there's churches that have discipleship classes. You go through a 12-week class, and then you've been...
To get baptized in water.
Yeah, to get baptized in water.
It's usually sometimes that's the only reason they have a discipleship class.
To be disciple. There you go.
Keep going at it.
Yeah, you're a disciple. There you go. Check, done.
Yeah.
As if 12 weeks you completed your discipleship class instead of it being really a lifelong journey. And that's the thing, is that Jesus, he made disciples, and that's where we get the word from and the concept from largely. And it's hard for us to know what that day-to-day looked like, but it was mostly day-to-day. And I think that the problem with that is that you, as a dad, don't know, to use that metaphor again, you don't know what moments are going to cement in your kids something good or bad, some lesson that'll be learned, something that years down the line they're going to look and go, my dad used to say, or my dad one time did this thing, and it'll form the people that they are. And for you, it was a Thursday. It was a Thursday morning. It was nothing special. It was nothing big that you did. It was just you being you, and then it communicated into them something else. And so I think that because of that, we end up kind of going, well, we need to quantify it. We need to be able to know that we're discipling. And I don't think that we get that ease of clarity. Instead, it's much more that we are, we being believers, but especially pastors, we are invited to know God personally, to get to know him, to have a relationship with him, and then to share that with others and to help them walk through the very practical day-to-day rhythms of life with it being God-centered. And so that looks different, like discipleship to somebody who is your neighbor who doesn't, know God. And I have some of those. I have some wonderful neighbors that we know and love who don't really know the Lord personally. Well, what that means is to influence them towards a life that is God-centered. We mention God in conversation with them because God's a part of our lives. Yeah. And as a pastor, this person isn't in my church. They maybe haven't heard me preach. Actually, one of them watches on YouTube. So some of them, maybe they do hear me preach. But largely, my role right now is just letting them see that my life is focused around Jesus, and it's making a difference in my life, and he's good to me, and he's good despite the things that sometimes even happen in my life. I get to extol the goodness of Jesus to them, and hopefully that invites them to kind of want to know more. And then it's just a journey. Again, it's not a complete moment. It's a journey of living life in a way that draws others towards Jesus.
I think I'm thinking about something. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I've been reflecting a little bit on, like, I feel like so much of my discussion is about discipleship in the context of believers' lives, when really, like, when I read the Bible, it's way more like discipleship was more about, like, finding people far from God and then helping them learn, like starting there. Mm-hmm. And I recognize, like, I think, I'm in this world of helping believers, not even just unbelievers, because we recognize there's this void of discipleship in the sense of, like, training and equipping, like teaching people how to share with others. A lot of people feel encouraged to invite people to church, and feel encouraged to attend, but few could really maybe replicate what they've learned or teach others what they've learned. And you mentioned earlier, like the goal, like what is the goal? Like, is the goal just to have like a good, whatever size church you need in order to, like, be able to sustain your salary, your like,
absolutely,
and to be a light in the community,
to afford the jet,
but, like, I mean, there's the, there are the wolves in sheep's clothing that are, like, sure, you know what I mean? Like, taking advantage of, but then there's just the, like, lack of vision, where I think people really have lost sight of, like, what is the goal? Mm-hmm. What is that?
Well, again, that's where I think it's so hard, because, I mean, we should be able to argue that Jesus would have been the best at this. If there was ever anyone that was good, Jesus was the best. And the goal ended up with a guy who absolutely betrayed him and then committed suicide. A guy who denied him 3 times and then felt like he was abandoned in that whole process by God and had to be sought after denying Jesus. He had to be sought after and chased a little bit there. Bunch of disciples that were really reckless. 2 of the ones who were some of the closest ones to him relationally, who at one point asked him to send fire on a city that had upset them. So we can look at Jesus and go, you did it the best, and still look and go, I can't imagine if I were in the day-to-day, it would feel very normal, it would feel very ordinary, and it would feel perhaps like it wasn't working. But it did. I mean, these guys went off, and then as disciples went. Yeah. So I think one of the metaphors I was thinking about how do we know if we're winning or not, or what's this all look like? I think of there's a guy in not my last church, but the first church that I was on staff at.
Yeah.
He was a young adult in my young adult ministry that I also got to be a part of, and he was a cellist that has since gone on to win awards and all that. He plays the cello so well, and I wish that I could. I wish that I could sit here right now and just for some background music for the podcast here for everyone, I could play the cello. It'd be so beautiful to hit those strings and have them just sing like he would do there at the church or at other things. And yet I am not capable. If you were to give me a cello right now and I were to grab it and start playing, it would not have those deep rhythms. It would just sound awful. It would be awful. And we get that because I'm not practiced. I haven't trained on it or anything like that. It would take a lot of time, a lot of effort for me to do that. We know that. If I were to run a marathon, at the Marine Corps half marathon here in Fredericksburg next year, I'd probably want to train for that. We get that for all these other things, and yet for following Jesus, for making disciples, we assume that somebody should just get it, rather than understanding that ourselves and others, we need to be trained for it. I mean, that's why Paul even told Timothy, after having been discipled a little bit by his parents or his mom and his grandmother, there was this woman, this trail of women in his life who had helped lead him to Jesus. Paul's talking about training for godliness, and I think that's essentially what we're looking at as a win, is that you're training, which means sometimes you're going to get knocked down. Sometimes you're going to have off days. Sometimes there's going to be moments where it's not sexy and it's not flashy in any way, but you are learning what it looks like to be godly, to be like Jesus.
It's interesting. I mean, I think you're like, Jesus should be the best example. Like, so if we look at his example, like, all right, the last mission, the last command he gave the church was this, like, go and make disciples.
Right.
There's this final, like, go and do. Like, do what I've done with you now for others. Mm-hmm. I do think that's like the full circle of like discipleship. This is my new pet peeve. I've been saying that like on all the shows of like discipleship is more than spiritual formation. It is also like deployment, send out, multiplication. Like there reaches this point where like you're already capable of sharing with others how to follow Jesus. Mm-hmm. But at some point, like you've really got to get off of being dependent on the pastor on Sunday to like you now are capable of helping others and learning what you've learned. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, an ideal objective and goal. And thinking about that goal of like, what did Jesus show us? Like he showed us how he sent out 12, I guess not 12, 11 that seemingly were not ready.
Right.
Like, cause to your whole point, like look at all this, the mistakes absolutely. They made, you know what I mean? Like, and yet like, he still like, gave them what they needed, and they came back to him. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could say like their heart was ready, even though they still were making plenty of mistakes. But like they had the tools. Yeah, they had the tools. They had the right pieces of information, but they weren't perfect. And I don't think that we would have graduated them in most church settings, much less send them out with our brand name. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that I'm a fan of brand names, but you know what I mean. Like, like we would be like, no, they're not ready, and yet like he somehow. I don't know. Like he said that they were ready, and then they changed the world. Right. And so I don't know. It's kind of thought provoking a little bit. I think about training, and I don't know that we do. And I'm like anything I share on this thing. Like a lot of the things that I say and ask are things that like I look at my own self and as a pastor and the times that I spent pastoring groups and gatherings and church and sermons like. Did I train or did I just, like tell people information? Mm-hmm. I don't know that I did a great job at teaching people how to pray. Mm-hmm. I told them how to pray. I don't know that I did a great job like coaching them. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that I think I told people, like points in a sermon. I don't know that I did a great job training people how to read the Bible and get to those conclusions themselves. Mm-hmm.
See, that's why I think going back to the metaphor, that it's so good to have the family discussion, and then it's so good to dial down into, okay, what does this look like for you? Because I think that since we're talking more to ministry leaders, pastors and all, I think that the temptation for a lot of us is to, without maybe even trying, but some of us absolutely, because it's our personality or we're overwhelmed by the demands of ministry, is to push away that part of ministry, that whole messy meeting with people one-on-one, walking through life with them on a regular basis, and stick more to the bigger picture. And we maybe say we're discipling our staff, but you're not. You're just telling them how to make sure that they have good ministry areas and whatnot. But you're right. Like, when are we actively teaching somebody how to pray or how to study the scriptures or how to rightly apply the scriptures? That would be what discipleship really should be. And in order to do that, you have to have those touch points with people where you're just doing life.
Discussion's got to be part of it,
Yeah.
not just like platform teaching.
Yeah. You're doing life. And here's the weird thing that I do. Anybody in my church who I'm discipling would absolutely say that, yep, he does this. I'll say, and I usually say, like, this is kind of awkward, but in my sermon on Sunday, or remember that sermon from a couple weeks ago. And the reason is because the teaching that I did, that I studied a lot for, and that I prayed over, and that I worked on, it was valuable. But now I get to be like, see what I remember what Jesus told us and we talked about a couple weeks ago. Here's right now, this is the moment where we apply it, and this is how we do it. And getting people to understand that connection, because it doesn't do any good for us to have Sunday mornings where we wow people to our excellence rather than going ahead and giving them tools in which to see the excellence of Jesus in their everyday lives. To see that he is excellent and that his way is best. That's what's going to be good preaching, is when they can go and say, okay, now I know how to apply this to my life. But again, preaching isn't sufficient enough, because people need in discipleship to be able to have somebody help them see the connections.
Yeah, and I think I had this concern that we've had mission drift and gone off course to the point where, like, the missions become doing church, not helping people be the church.
Yeah.
And there's a difference there. Like, doing church is focused on coming together and giving information and doing the 3 worship songs, the praise song, then the worship song, and then the praise song, and, and then doing the 3-point message. But, like, when you get into, like, how to help people be church, it's like you really emphasize, like, the application.
Mm-hmm.
How are we going to live this out? It's less about how much can I tell you, and more about how much can I help you live this out. And there's just a totally different depth needed for that. So let's shift from like how do we do this? How are ways that you're doing this? Listeners who are on the fence or are trying to figure this out, like what's some practices that you've done that I'd love to hear about, like anything it's like you're like, man, I tried this and it was an epic fail, so don't do that.
Yeah.
Or we can just focus on like what are you trying that you feel like is working? And what are some things that you want to grow into that you feel like could work better? Because I don't think there's any one church or pastor that's got this figured out.
Mm-hmm.
And we see Jesus, he did a lot of different tactics anyway to connect with people when we look at his life and ministry. So I don't think it's a cookie cutter thing. But I'd love to hear from you then, like how can you as the church and church leaders better create some pathways, some practices for better discipleship and disciple-making culture?
Well, so it ties right into what I was just saying, because I think one of the problems we have in the United States and generally in the whole North America is that we are in a very individualistic society. We just really like our own space. We've quadrant ourselves off. We work with people, but even there, sometimes we're not relating to them. We're just working with them. And so anyway, I think what the danger can be for a lot of pastors, churches, ministries is that because of that, we're missing one of the most important elements to discipleship, which is just the accidental discipleship, the happenstance moments. You look at Jesus's ministry and life, and some of the stories that they wanted to make sure were canonized, were included in the scripture, were not part of the plan for the disciples and Jesus that day. It just happened that this woman came by and grabbed his garment as he was going through the crowd. It just so happened that as he was teaching, these guys came down through a roof. I mean, the teaching was part of the plan. The healed cripple was not part of the plan. So what ends up happening is if our plans that we have are in seclusion, are in these isolated spaces of our church offices, or just the few people that we normally spend time with, and maybe it doesn't ever get real, then I think that we miss opportunities to just have discipleship moments. And I think also connected to that, Not to, again, keep it so organic that it's not helpful. I'm going to get to some practical things that we do at Alive that are helpful.
Okay.
But I do think that it is got to be a mind shift for pastors and ministry leaders to really themselves understand that the teachings of Jesus apply to everyday life. And so there's moments where it's like, hey, why don't we pause and we pray about that? Here in the middle of the Starbucks, or here as we're in the grocery store, let's have this conversation or whatever. It's got to be able to be lived out in the wild and practiced in the wild. So last night we had a moment that I honestly think was good, and I also wish I could do it differently. So we're doing a thing right now that's helping with our church connecting in this way, where during the summer months where people are more transient and life groups, can feel like, oh man, our attendance is so hit or miss with people. We said, hey, if you want to continue in your life groups, go on through the summer. But what we do, we started it last year, we're doing it again this year, is every Wednesday night, we're going to have a meal together at the church building, and we're going to have family style dinner together.
Yeah.
It's going to be home cooked food on a nice plate with actually tablecloths.
And if y'all don't know Jonathan, he likes really good food.
I do like really good food. It's really important. It makes the moment.
It gives you a conversation too. It
does.
Like, how the heck did you make that?
Right?
Yeah.
And also the secret ingredients that make it so good. So we had lasagna last night. It was good. Madeline said it was my best. I actually thought it was too wet. I needed a drier.
Okay.
Anyway, it doesn't matter. But we had lasagna last night, and we had conversation. And as we have this, large table with all these people around, we usually will have it kind of wild for a little while. Everyone's talking with whoever's around them, and then we get to kind of talking. Okay, let's get to know each other better. So go around and your name, and then so one of the questions last night was, what's one of the most memorable sunsets or sunrises you've ever seen and experienced? And so some great stories getting to know people. So we'll go around and we'll have a few questions like that.
Yeah.
And then we get to some more serious questions. So one of the ones that somebody in the group had posed was, who's one of the first people that you remember telling you about Jesus? And got to hear stories of parents and Sunday school teachers, of neighbors, and all kinds of people like that being the first person who this person remembers telling them about Jesus. And then we even got to a point where it just, again, naturally flowed into the songs that have moved us, the worship songs that have moved us most. Which songs really just, man, get you emotionally like, wow, God is amazing or whatever. And then after talking about that, we were like, we should sing one. So we turned on this, we're in our auditorium, we turned on the keyboard and just sang without any lyrics or anything like that, a song that we all fairly knew well. And I guess that's the one part that I wish we would have done. No keyboard, just done an a cappella in that moment, because that's more replicatable in a living room or in a dining room of somebody in their home.
Sure.
And I want in these moments, it's biblical. You see that even in the Last Supper, it says that the disciples and Jesus, before going out to the Garden of Gethsemane, they sang a hymn. They sang a song together. I think the rhythms of singing songs, of teaching, of using the scriptures to change our lives have been too relegated to a Sunday morning. And both pastors and other people in the church would need to see that this is a part of everyday life in order for us to actually have it do what it's meant to do. So
it's interesting. Yeah. When you can only sing, pray, and get into scripture in these very formal settings, which then require such, like, it does
pomp and circumstance.
Well, it just takes away like with ordinary movement. Like, I think your ordinary average guy then feels like, I can't do that.
Right. So I think that allowing ourselves, it's not one or the other. It's just allowing ourselves to be very intentional about, hey, can we lay hands, the three of us here at the Starbucks, over you? Because you just said that you got this injury that you're going in to get checked by a doctor. Let's pray over you right now. Like, you don't need to let's go to the church, let's go down to the altar and let's do that. And I think allowing ourselves to bring it out into the wild a little bit more, feel uncomfortable, because that's the other thing too, I guess, that like we probably all feel more comfortable it being in those secluded spaces. It might be good for us to recognize, like, if I were to do that in a Starbucks, just to bow our heads and pray, it might feel a little bit awkward. Or if I were to at our dining room table with people that I know love Jesus, like if I were to say, hey, do you guys want to sing that song? Many people, I get it. Many people don't like to sing. Many people feel awkward about it, but that's an important thing to do. It's good for us to do. So allowing that to become more of an expectation than it is going to be really important.
I think there is something there to like the church environments where everything is only at church and in church and on Sunday morning. And I mean, I like, my hope is for listeners like that they take that next step and say, hey, we're going to figure out groups. And if you got to start at the church, do it. But like, my next hope would be like, hey, get out of church buildings.
Yeah.
Like, you're just trying to get, like, how do we live this out in our daily lives, not just on our Sunday morning, like, routine, you know, and making it very ordinary, making it very approachable. And yet, like, I do agree, like, initially, like, even some of those things, like, I remember feeling uncomfortable in that setting, in that space. I mean, but then you start doing it for a little while and it's just like, oh yeah, like, this is, like, I'm fine with this. This is what I do. But there is people have to work through, like, bringing their spiritual life back into everyday life. If it's only ever been on Sunday mornings, that's hard for people.
It really is.
But I think that's also where I think like we have taught people how to do church, not be church, and being church isn't relegated to Sunday mornings. But then as ministry leaders and church leaders and pastors, like we've got to figure out then how do we get people, like, Sunday morning service isn't the goal.
Right. Yeah, I think so. I think it means that we need to, as pastors, ministry leaders, and in general, but as pastors and ministry leaders, it'd be really good to just amp up the intentionality, especially with maybe staff or people that you're close with naturally already, and say, you know what, this week I'm going to ask them to pray outside of a Sunday morning context or outside of a ministry context for somebody or for something, or I'm going to encourage. I think that the practices matter. So it might be that you're more inclined to go, hey, you know, Alex, it sounds like with what you're talking about, maybe you should fast sometime this week. And I'll join you in praying that day. These things that aren't Sunday morning things that are part of the rhythms of a believer need to be intentionally encouraged. And then I think the other part of it is, as ministry leaders, helping people to see, which means we need to see it too, how the everyday teachings of Jesus, the things that the Bible instructs us, impact everyday decisions. So helping somebody who's going through some marriage issues or a parenting issue or an issue at work, and just kind of, instead of doing the maybe too cliche, what would Jesus do? But asking the question of, okay, you've got this situation at work. Where do you see God in this situation? That's one of the first questions I love to ask. And I think it's good for pastors and ministry leaders to have a couple questions that they just are go-to questions for them that constantly can help them and the other person look to Jesus and his ways. But where do you see the Lord in this situation? Because sometimes people go, I feel like he's abandoned me. That's great. That's great that you are aware of that. It's not great that you feel like he's abandoned you. It's great that you're aware of that. Cool. Because if you go into doing anything now in this situation where you are convinced that God has abandoned you, you are not going to do something that is well.
You're not going to focus on what he is leading you to,
right,
if you're already focused on the fact that he's not even with you anymore.
Right. Or if you're
totally different mindset and headspace of how you're going to confront the situation.
Yeah. Or somebody might go, well, I feel like getting to the election time of year this year, I feel like God would support my view, my this. Okay. What's led you to believe that? How do you believe that God handles these kind of things? We certainly can't imagine that Jesus gives us detailed bullet points for how to handle an American election and people that disagree with us politically. But I do think that it's really helpful for people to realize, okay, where's Jesus in this? How do you honor Jesus in this? What's it look like to depend on him? What's it look like to, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in him and acknowledge him rather than leaning on your own understanding? And as we get people to do that, it's a shift, because what ends up happening is our minds, as I think it's Philippians, no, it's probably Romans. This is embarrassing. I should know it. But the transforming of our minds, is that Romans?
Oh, I don't know.
I can't believe this. All the pastors right now are thinking that I don't know anything because I'm blanking right now, like they've never blanked. Anyway, but the renewal of our minds, which I'm convinced now is Romans 12, is because our minds are geared towards what they've been trained towards.
Yeah.
You know, we in our flesh, we're trained towards thinking of things according to the flesh. We're trained towards thinking of, this is my world and I'm going to do things and I'm the center of the universe. We were, as kids, convinced of that. And so even when God comes along, sometimes God is used to further my own agenda, my own means. And so getting people to, and that's where I think also it bleeds into, if you do this, into people being more open to going across the street, across the ocean, and telling other people, because you start to realize more and more the goodness of God and his worthiness of being worshiped and how I'm not the center of everything. He is. But that's not a bad thing. That's actually a great thing because he loves me so much that he's invited me into this. And so as we see him in the everyday rhythms, we start to train our mind, and the Spirit works in us, and spiritual leaders help to retrain our mind to see God's presence, to see God's activity, to trust him even when we don't see him, and to understand his ways are best. And so we start handling little moments differently. And those little moments, as C.S. Lewis once said, those little moments we kind of undervalue could be moments where, like, that's a hill that we end up launching a better attack from. Or if we give it up, the enemy has a greater standpoint in our lives to attack us.
It's good. Hey, friend, we're going to jump right back into this discussion about discipleship and disciple making. But before we jump in, let me just highlight ordinarymovement.com, because that is the reason that I have been able to provide this podcast in the first place. There's this whole community and a movement of disciple making where we've basically taken this entire process of discipleship. We've distilled it into a group model, taking people through 26 sessions. We have a men's track, a women's track, and we have a track that can fit in just for men and women together. It fits into church structures with small groups. It also fits into a person's daily life, where even if they've never even been in a small group and their churches don't have small groups, they don't even know where to begin. It is for the local church and meant to be done with and through your local church, but it is also designed for ordinary men and ordinary women. And it was designed by ordinary men and ordinary women. And so anyone, be a roofer, an entrepreneur, a business person, a stay-at-home mom, a waiter, whatever level of education you have or don't have, it doesn't matter. We've taken all the guesswork out of how do you bring together people and learn how to follow Jesus together in a high challenge, high grace environment that helps people become disciples who make disciples. And it's all available to you. Check it out at ordinarymovement.com. All right, back to the show. What are some ways that we can measure? Like, how would you even help somebody measure where they're at? If they're a ministry leader, church leader, pastor, like if they're moving towards the direction of better discipleship, sending out disciple makers, or if maybe they're just doing the routine motions. Like what can we analyze? What can we measure to help kind of steer, vet?
Yeah, that's a really good question, but I think it's also a really hard question because to, use the metaphor of back to the family, how do you measure if your kids are being raised in a healthy way? I mean, you can think of some things. Some things come to mind.
They're not like specific for every family, for every kid.
Right.
But there's general.
There are
markers that are like, okay, I need to work on how my daughter reacts when she gets mad.
Yeah. I mean, even at the most basic level, if your daughter is malnourished, she's not actually getting fed things that are healthy, it's bad. But maybe some of those beneath the surface kinds of things of how does she handle disappointment? As she grows and matures, is she handling disappointment in a more mature way? Those are the ways that you kind of know. Measuring it, that's hard to do in a quantifiable way.
But looking generally speaking at the American church.
Yeah.
I think you can kind of see some areas where it's like where it becomes insular country club versus like missional disciple making. Like how do you even begin?
So I guess that's what I'm saying. Like in some ways, measurement makes it sound so much more convenient than it is. Okay. It ends up being a little bit more of getting the pulse of something, getting a sense generally, and you're going to have outliers too. But I would say, so now I'm not just going to keep on pushing against it. I think there are things you look for sacrifice. I mean, Jesus in John 13, that one I do know, by the way. In John 13, John writes that getting ready for that Last Supper moment, he had loved his disciples. He was going to love them till the end. So then, that could then lead into so many different things. If you read that he, having loved those who were given to him, he was going to love them to the end, he could do something so heroic. And what's he do next? He gets down and he washes their feet. That's part of him loving them to the end, all the way through the cross. And so Jesus also continually taught he didn't come to serve, but he didn't come to be served, but to serve. He told his disciples, now you've seen me do this, serve others and sacrifice. I mean, the Good Samaritan, some of the greatest stories he told were of sacrifice. God showed us love by laying down his life. So if your people in the church
go ahead. Yeah, finish it.
are not living sacrificially, that would be an indicator something's busted. If you're seeing that sacrifice is being made, it might be financial sacrifice. People are giving towards the needs of others, not necessarily through the church, but maybe through the church, but they're giving towards the needs of others. They're being generous. They're doing without. They are sacrificing things, and you're hearing stories of that. Or they're sacrificing their time and convenience. And again, the careful thing I think that I would say needs to be distinguished is not for the machine of ministry, if you're going to call it that.
I was kind of where I was going to they sacrifice their deacon on Sunday.
Right. So there's going to be sacrifices like that, but I'm talking about the sacrifices of they're on their anniversary getting their spouse's permission, and they're sitting in a hospital room for hours and hours with a widow who's having knee surgery, who's scared to go into this alone. Somebody I know very closely who did that. And that's the kind of sacrifice that indicates, Jesus is doing a profound work in your life. It's the sacrifice of we're going to do without some things because we want to invite some people into our homes and be able to provide for them. And so the convenience or the safety or all these maybe American, especially idols that we would have are being laid down at the feet of Jesus. So you're hearing stories and seeing people do things usually outside of a Sunday morning or the regular works of a church that are sacrificial.
Yeah.
I think that there's going to be strange unity as well. I think that's a marker of discipleship. And what I mean is that you see that in the New Testament. You see them having to fight for it, but you see that there was this, these people shouldn't be getting along with each other. Like the Jews and Gentiles, the Greeks and the
Republicans and Democrats who hang out.
There you go.
That's right now we're turning slowly into a country of blue churches and red churches.
Yep.
Which is for me very concerning.
Yeah.
In lieu of churches about Jesus where blue and red and purple would all come together and they lay that down and sacrificed, for the sake of hey, we're going to figure out how to love Jesus together, even though we have differences.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Where you fall on gun rights and all that stuff, it's a regular occurrence. It comes up in conversation. And I think that one of the tricky parts of ministry should be, and one of the signs of success in discipleship should be that you're having some of that tricky conversations. There's a verse in Psalms that talks about the stall where the cattle are is messy. It's basically what it's saying. And if there are no cattle, the stall's clean. And so the idea is, without the cattle, you're not going to have the milk, you're not going to have the meat, you're not going to have all the good things that a farmer needs. You're not going to get the work done. Yeah. And so you need some of the mess in order to have the ministry really being all it's meant to be.
Yeah.
So I think that in a sign of success in discipleship will be not that you're actually not having drama, not that you're not having conflict. It's that you're having the right kind of conflict about drama that makes sense. Like you're moving people towards this strange unity of, I know you see this issue about how to school kids or how to, handle, again, the topic of racism or whatever, but let's come together. Let's see what Jesus has to say. And even if we end up disagreeing in some ways, let's continue to look to Jesus together in unity.
Yeah. That's good. I think the sacrifice one is an interesting one to gauge as a pastor of do I see people doing that? And I think we've kind of turned going into church into a sacrifice. Attending church is a sacrifice. I get it. If you have a busy life and you have kids and you got to wake up in the morning, you got to get to church. Mm-hmm. And yet that's not we get to go to church. And I don't mean that in the whole hyped up arc model. People now are that's how they talk from the platform. Yeah. I get to lead, but no, from a true, people in the world don't have churches to go to or fear for their life if they were to go to church. We actually get to come together and worship. It's a privilege. It's an opportunity, not a have to. But then there's the sacrifice. And I think there is this place that we want to move people to where they are willingly sacrificing, not for you or me or church's vision anymore, like it's because Jesus put something on their heart to do, an assignment, and they were invited to sacrifice for the sake of that assignment for Jesus because he's worth it.
Yeah.
And attending and giving, I mean, there's giving sacrificially, but I think also Christians just kind of do that out of routine. It's like, if you grew up Christian, it's probably not a sacrifice. Whereas maybe for someone who's like an unchurched person, I always think I was like, what would it be like to talk to an unchurched person and talk about tithing?
Yeah.
Whereas like, if I grew up tithing, it's just like, I thought about not tithing, but that scared me to death. You know what I mean? Like,
Sure.
I don't know. It's an interesting sacrifice is a good marker to consider. Do we see people authentically doing this because God led them to do something unique missionally?
Yeah. I think there's so much overlap, but I think with that is an others-centeredness. So I find that actually maybe my experience is a little different than yours, that like some of the church people that I know grew up going to church aren't giving a dime to the church confuse me so much because I'm looking at it and going, you come in here and drink the coffee and you enjoy the benefits of having a kids ministry where they're background checked and we have supplies and you love that we get to do these outreaches that cost us hundreds and thousands of dollars to bless our community. Like, you are clearly benefiting from so many of the perks of being at this church. And how do you think it gets paid for? Whereas other people who maybe come from a non-church background, they get the nonprofit element of it.
Yeah.
And so they get like, oh yeah, I'm a part of this, so I need to give to
fascinating.
this.
That's
So for them,
true.
they get it faster sometimes.
Yeah.
For other people, it's just the religious other. And so it's the church. They'll figure it out. I don't know. I haven't figured out how.
No, you're right. I'm assuming that I mean, but there's so many. It's the consumer issue that we have in our culture right now, which is like, all of this is for me.
Right.
Which is and I brought that up. I shared a post recently about like church in the United States and the decline of Christianity that we see. And there's the like, what is the like, how do we shift this? And I think at some point it's like the church broadly has to shift from like, church is about us and what we get out of it and what we want it to look like and what we like to like, we are the church and it's about others. And we're going to make sacrifices and do things differently for the sake of reaching others.
And that's where I started saying about it overlapping, and it's hard to distinguish these things with fine lines, because sacrifice and the, what was the other thing I said about, strange unity. Those two things, it's moving from that self-centered viewpoint to an others-centered viewpoint. Like Paul said in Philippians 2, that we consider the needs of others. Yeah. And so it's that idea that you're not just looking to your own interests, which you're allowed to. You're allowed to have your own interests, your own hobbies. But I think that this is some of the cutting edge of discipleship that nobody thinks of as the cutting edge, is just learning how to relate to people better. Learning how to actually care about other people and communicate in a way that shows them you care about them. I'm convinced in America that if we would just learn how to be more emotionally aware and genuinely share the love of have the love of Jesus move in our hearts so much that we care about other people, especially people that we wouldn't naturally care about, and they'll know that we wouldn't naturally care about them, that'll be such a significant inroad to being able to share the gospel with them.
Yeah. And I think like all this conversation, like I think it could in different lanes go back full circle. One would be like, you're just not going to get all of this out of only Sunday morning services.
Yeah.
And so as a church leader, whatever role you have of influencing and leading people, like people need outlets besides just showing up to get information, and saying, hi, how are you? And everybody says, I'm fine.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like creating groups, creating little outreaches, creating opportunities that are not all on you to lead, but you're like helping people send out leaders, training, giving them room to run. Like it provides this space for this stuff to happen. But it takes intentionality.
Yeah. And I was thinking about that too. It's one of the things I forgot to say so far. I think that both with pastors and ministry leaders and just general church people who have a heart for discipling and making disciples of other people, that one of the challenges that we need to get over is being willing to just pull the trigger, just being able to say, okay, I'm going to put this person on the spot, or I'm going to have this conversation or something like that. We can feel like, well, I'm having this family over for dinner. I'm not saying every time you have a neighbor over for dinner, you need to go, okay, so how can I pray for you or get right into that. But I do think that what ends up happening is we're convinced as ministry leaders that we don't want to be pushy. We don't want to be too much with even people that we're discipling at church. We're getting a new couple over for dinner. As a pastor, how many times do you have availability to have new people over to your house for dinner or go out to a restaurant and eat with them? You only have so many times. So I'm much more of the mind now of maximizing the time. And so what I'm saying here is that, like, rather than we're building the relational equity for a future time where we're going to eventually get to things that are spiritually significant, recognizing that the spiritual significance of that moment is still there and needs to be tapped.
I've been thinking about this. I heard the other day somebody mentioned like they didn't want people to feel like projects.
Yeah.
So as a result, they just kind of like, they're not very direct.
Yep.
And they're not very forthright of like, hey, like, I'd love to help you learn how to follow Jesus. Would you be open to meeting up once a week for a season? And like, any questions you have, I'm learning with you, but like, I would love, like, whatever you have to offer. Or it could be like, hey, I'm learning how to follow Jesus. Would you want to learn with me? Mm-hmm. So you can kind of like, you can come as the guide. Yeah. If you feel like you're in that season, or you can just come as the friend and like tag along with me.
Yep.
I'm reading this book. Would you want to do it with me? So it's like, you don't have to know any answers. You're just inviting. But like, so instead of that direct approach, people I think feel intimidated of like, I wouldn't want somebody, like, I don't want to feel like a project.
I don't want to pressure them. But I want to give it time. I want to build the relational equity.
So you do is you draw it out. You're avoiding just the direct ask, which Jesus gave. He's like, hey, follow me.
Yep.
And people chose not to. But other people did. And I think sometimes like in this fear of just being direct, and maybe there's this project thing, which I think is almost this like counter that we're afraid of whatever. But like same time, like I was like, man, like if I knew somebody like in a season of life that's ahead of me that could help me grow, and they saw me as a project and they could help me grow, I'd love to be that person's project.
I'll take it.
Yeah. Like, sure. You know, like, but it's because I trust that they'd value me. And that's really what I think the fear is, of people feeling not like we wouldn't value them, but I do value them relationally. But I also recognize that like, if this person doesn't want to be invited, if ultimately they're going to say no when the invitation comes, there might be somebody else out there who would love to be invited and would love to grow and has not been invited, and they're just waiting and they're ready, and we're missing out on that person because we're so afraid of this area over here of just being direct about what we have to offer and give and helping people learn how to follow Jesus with us. Yeah. So I don't know that I have that totally worked out a little bit. I just recognize there's some pros and cons in that area.
Yeah. And I think that probably generationally, we're in a generation of church ministry that is still in a very, on the spectrum, reactionary to that very corner, evangelist yelling at everyone. No relational equity was given. It was just, telling people the gospel truth. And if they didn't accept it, well, that's their own dang fault, kind of thing. I think maybe some of the younger ministry leaders are reacting to that. So we're much more of the type of like, hey, just do the relational thing. And I've been talking a lot about relational elements to this whole thing. But what I'm saying is I think that because of that spectrum, people fall over the edge and they go to the point of they're constantly kicking the can down the road instead of realizing there was a moment right there. You could have just... You could have spoken something or said something or asked to pray for them or with them or said, hey, do you want to get together for coffee and we'll just talk through a book that I'm reading? No pressure to make it anything more than that.
If you get rejected, like, it's actually a win. Yeah. I mean, we want people to say yes, but like, you're better off hearing yeses and nos than not hearing anything for a long time, because like ultimately then your life looks more like Jesus.
Right.
Just kind of, I mean, it's just countercultural. Like, we don't want to be rejected.
Yeah.
And yet, like, Jesus faced a lot of rejection. And I think that's something I realized a little bit lately of like, man, like there's some seasons in my life where like I'm not encountering anything that Jesus said that we would encounter, that he encountered. And it's just because I'm not taking risks.
Mm-hmm. So Alex, I think that kind of, for me, just pulls back to a question you asked me earlier about pastors and ministry leaders being able to look and see if they're succeeding or not, see if they're doing discipleship well or not. I do think it's one of those things, like so many other things like it, where it's hard on a day-to-day basis to really accurately gauge, to say, today, did I do it?
Sure.
I think it's probably something that every so often we ought to stop and just do some reflection. I know it's becoming more and more common for me to hear pastors talking about the importance of taking these retreats, or maybe other times that are set out during the course of the year where they just kind of pull away and spend time with the Lord. But I think in that it's good for us to step aside, pull away, and just go, okay, what am I seeing right now in myself and in the people? Because I would say if you're succeeding as a discipler, then you're loving Jesus more and you're growing into the character and likeness of Jesus more. And if you're not, that might be something worth looking at. Now, maybe a reality of like, wow, you're just going through something and God's revealing something that was already there that you didn't know, and now you're feeling like more scum than you were, but he's lovingly working you through it. But if it's truly like your character is eroding, the machine of ministry or whatever, or the sense that everyone expects me to be this person, so I keep on putting on that front. As a pastor or ministry leader, if you keep on doing that for very long, you're going to implode and you're going to be one of the stories that we get to see about. And then also being able to stop and every so often look and go, okay, what am I seeing on the landscape of ministry? You might realize I'm not spending time with people. With VBS and with all these other things that we've had on the church calendar, I've been busy working alongside people, but not spending time with them, not actually relationally connecting with them, not doing real ministry. At that point, it might be good, especially if you have the power to do it, to start saying, all right, we're going to pull some things. We're going to like maybe even like take some things out of our calendar so that we can free it up. Or I just need to change the way I'm approaching these things. I need to be more mindful. Yeah. I think, for me, there was a book that I read, and it's not even worth necessarily saying what it is, but there's a book I read in January that helped me re-see, that's not a word, to see differently the way that I view my time. Sure. And I was so impacted by it that I'm planning on next week when I'm on vacation reading it again, because I know I got some things from it the first go around, but I want to keep on letting it reframe the way I'm thinking. And so I think that if we can get a sense of, ministry is not going to be real ministry. It's not going to be so cut and clean like it happens in these predetermined moments on Sunday mornings. But I want to make sure that...
It might look a little bit more like Jesus.
It might,
ministry.
Right? Now
people were ready to kill him.
Jesus went to the synagogue. Jesus and his disciples, they were in the temple and the synagogue. So some people are like, listen, he never prioritized the gathering that we see it. I'm like, yes, he did. And his disciples did too.
I'm not saying in this sense, large gathering. I'm saying just the way, like the cumulative, like there were large gatherings, small gatherings. There were moments where everybody loved him. There were moments when the crowd wanted to kill him.
Absolutely.
All of the above.
Right. And so you're going to
people betraying him.
Yeah. So you can't basically measure, are you succeeding because people are liking you? Because sometimes you're winning people over to you, and sometimes you're absolutely getting them off against you.
Gave them all free bread. Of course they're going to love you.
Right. Exactly. So some people will go ahead and say ministry leaders who are doing things like that aren't successes. It's like, no. Jesus was a success. He was doing the right thing, and he was feeding people, and they loved him for it. So there are moments where it's that. There's moments where it's the crowd wants to abandon you because you're talking about eating their, your flesh and blood. That follows that. I think that what ends up being a good determiner is if we can every so often kind of take back. It's like going on a journey. You've got a compass and you've got a map. Every so often, you want to make sure that you're checking in instead of just walking. You walk a couple feet, you kind of check in and go, am I still on track?
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're called to do. I think we're called to depend upon Jesus. That's why, for instance, we don't get to tell other people that you need to trust in the Lord, acknowledge him in all your ways, depend on him, and then go about ministry like we already know what we're doing.
Yeah.
In fact, if anything, God should be constantly reforming our ministries because he's the one leading it, and we're basing it all off of his wisdom and his understanding and not our own. And so being able to recalibrate every so often, which is another reason why I think ministry leaders need to prioritize Sabbathing and spending time with the Lord and spending time to reflect a little bit. Then one, I think it'll encourage a lot of ministry leaders that are going, again, I didn't know that conversation with my daughter was going to be so meaningful, but I'm seeing now the fruit of it years later. I'm seeing the fruit of these moments. It's worth it. It's worth the sweat, the tears, the time invested to actually get coffee with this person, or to have them over for a dinner, or to meet with them in the hospital, or to, it's good for me to get into the mess with that guy and to actually confront him on his sin, because it's going to glorify God. It's making a difference.
All right, fine. I have two questions left. So one before the last, just practical things when people are even pouring into them, but there's that they step out in the kind of assignment mode, disciple maker mode. They what does that look like? How do you do that? How are you as a pastor creating environments for people to go from disciple to disciple making disciples?
Hmm.
What does that look like?
So you're asking about mobilizing people to make disciples and
Yeah,
getting them
yeah,
from just receiving to that.
exactly. Because there's a shift.
Yeah.
And I do think it takes intentionality for us as church leaders. Like if there's not room in there's not pathways, there's not frameworks,
Mhm.
there's not opportunities, there's not invitations, then people do just stay in this position where they just keep,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like how and then there's the people that like they want to. Not every environment like can they even find an opportunity to. So like, how are you inviting people to figure out the
Mhm.
next step and being mobilized?
That's hard because I think it can be a little case by case.
Mhm.
Some people,
Just good though, but like,
yeah.
yeah,
Some people, the spiritual maturity just comes to them. They have the wherewithal, the giftings, whatever, to, for instance, more quickly than others, move into like a teaching like role, like actual teaching groups or teaching others. But here's what I would say generally, as a rule of thumb,
yeah,
we should be empowering people to do that and to be others focused earlier than we feel like we should be. Like right off the bat, Jesus is, again, our example. Jesus is mobilizing the disciples to coordinate the feeding of the 5,000. He's having them help coordinate all kinds of other things, very logistical. And then he's also sending them off to do ministry. And so this is earlier. We already agreed that we would, maybe even after all of those years of ministry, we would have some questions about some of the disciples being released into actually going off and doing it. That we might say, those 3 years were good, but let's give them a few more years till they're ready. Jesus, on the other hand, was while he was doing those 3 years, he was releasing them to it. So I think that it's really good for us as we're making disciples to not have in our minds, okay, I'm pouring into this person, and then eventually they're going to pour into other people. It is the expectation that as we're pouring into them, it should already start leaking out in different ways, leaking out in the positive way. So it's a matter of, I'm meeting with some guy and we're talking about some of the ways that he handles his marriage and what he's learning from that. And then maybe it's just a matter of like, hey, who do you know that's also struggling? Because again, usually they'll say, I've got another buddy who's struggling with it. Oh, cool. What did you say to them? How did you talk to them? Allowing them to see that they can now replicate what's been done for them, doing this for other people. And the funny thing is it just takes that intentionality of the person who's doing the discipling, asking them, you're essentially asking, where do you see yourself having the opportunity to do this for somebody else? Because what ends up happening is we naturally come into it a lot of times going, oh, I get to receive. I get to be met with. I get to share my problems. I get to have somebody who spiritually leads me. And that's really exciting, but it's really not necessarily natural for us to look and go, oh, and I can also do this for others. Because people are going to think, oh, you're the really smart gal. You're the really smart guy who has all the answers and knows it all, which we know is not true. But when they can be mobilized early on to go, hey, why don't you say something to them? Or why don't you you get them to apply it themselves. Can you help me out with this? You get them to move beyond themselves, since others-centeredness or not being self-centered and being others-focused is going to be one of those things that we later on look as a metric of success. You don't want to wait. You don't want to make it harder for you or them by having this long airstrip that you're going to take them on before they launch into that. Get them launched into that early on and then build up from that. Yeah. You don't launch them off at the deep end, but getting them in small ways to start seeing how they can replicate this, how they can give this away, how they can apply this, how they can help others. That's going to be one of the best ways for when you can then launch them into bigger things.
It's good. It's good. All right. So finally, we talked about unreached earlier.
Yeah.
Like I'm on an elevator with you. I'm a whatever, like ministry leader. We were talking. I'm like, man, we do a ton of missions. Like we go to Jamaica, we do Mexico. We've been doing that stuff for like 30 years. We have a huge heart for missions. But you're talking about unreached. Like, what do you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Elevator pitch.
Okay.
Go.
What I mean is that there are parts of the world where, because of the government structures, geographical issues, or whatever else, they do not have believers nearby in their communities, in their marketplaces, in their workplaces. And so as long as we continue to funnel our funds and our people to the places where they already have that and neglect those other places, none of that changes. But Jesus wants those people to know about him. So we as the church need to be intentionally strategic about going and resourcing those places so they have a chance.
It's good.
it's a hard one to elevator pitch because it really is. It's something else when you get to see it firsthand. We just it's comfortable to go to places like Mexico or Jamaica and
I was a missionary in Mexico.
listen, not knocking
So
it.
just like,
It's just
if we
comfortable
use this clip
because you get the sense of, oh my gosh, sociologically or financially, these people are maybe not as well off as us. We can help them, and we do basically more Good Samaritan kind of style ministry, but it's not going to be as much likely true frontier missions work where they're hearing the gospel for the very first time. It is very foreign to go to a culture, and I've been to some places in the world where everyone's Muslim. Everyone assumes everyone's Muslim. It's just a given. Nobody really ever anywhere in that city is likely going to know about Jesus, serve him, and dedicate their lives to following him. And so when it's so entrenched, it just seems like, well, one, you can think, why would anybody even bother? But two, it's one of those things where without some people who are going to bother, there's no natural way that it's going to come about. Like, we've got to do something.
Yeah.
The people who in Jamaica maybe have a rough day and go, oh, you know what? I think I'm going to go to the church down the road. They have that opportunity. The people in places like Iraq or Iran or Kuwait, yeah, they don't have that. And so my pitch to ministry leaders is usually to kind of say, hey, you have a strategic position to not just be like, oh, that stinks. No, you have a strategic position to say, we're going to do something about that. We're going to be intentional about the way that we as a church do missions, so that it's not abandoning maybe people that are doing good Samaritan kind of things, but we want to make sure the gospel of Jesus Christ is going to all parts of the world.
Yeah, that's good. If I was to like put out there like an analogy, it's like if let's say you didn't know anything about finance, and all of a sudden you're like, shoot, how am I going to retire? And you start looking into retirement, and you start having to learn about like currency debasement, inflation, money printing, the national debt, social security, insolvency, and your mind is blown, and you're like, wow, I'm going to be really intentional if I'm going to meet this retirement goal, because I had no idea of what all I needed to overcome and how I need to invest my money. I think that whole like mind blowing, like there's so much to learn that we think we knew because we've grown up hearing about money all our lives.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what happens in missions when you start to go down the rabbit trail of like, well, I thought missions was just anything out of the United States.
Yeah.
Or even in our own community.
Yeah.
Now. But then you start to learn the differentiation between like the 1040, the least reached versus global, know, and where need is and what access is and all of that.
Yeah.
So, worth looking into.
Absolutely, because again, that reframes the way we even look at missions. Back in the day when I grew up, felt like everybody was a missionary, wore a suit and tie, went into a tribe or some village somewhere, planted a church building, and had people come to the church building. And now, especially in the 1040 window, that's not the way you can or even maybe should do missions. And so, like you said, there's this whole new world that opens up to, well, then what does it look like to have everyday Christians living in a way that's intentional, that's going to help make disciples of people that have never heard the gospel until they met that person who now lives in the apartment across from them, or who works for them or with them, or and they get to see Jesus lived out. That reframing of missions is going to be so helpful for us to embrace as we go into this next season of ministry, where I believe that God is moving ministry leaders to really look at missions differently, and to not just kind of go, this is comfortable, this is easy, but like you said, what's going to give us the best long-term results? What is honestly most honoring to Jesus and what he called us to do? Yeah,
being good stewards.
Yep.
With us, yeah. Well, hey man, thank you. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Hey, thank you so much for checking out the show today. I want to invite you to check out the next show. And listen, if you are wanting to learn more about better strategic, thoughtful, intentional discipleship and disciple making, please subscribe, follow us on whatever platform you love to listen or watch on. Please do like, comment, share. Check out ordinarymovement.com for all the resources that we provide in disciple making, discipleship frameworks and pathways and processes that equip everyday, ordinary men and women who want to follow Jesus and be disciples who make disciples. Finally, I just want to invite you, please drop a comment. Let me know what questions you have. Feel free to give me feedback. I'm growing as a podcast host. I would love to hear from you. That being said, check out the next show, and we'll see you next time.